The Juno World Affairs Council presents The Czech Republic, the European Union, and the Rise of Populism with Dr. Martin Nekola. Nekola is a Prague-based independent scholar who serves as the project coordinator at the Czechoslovak Talks, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving the life stories of Czechoslovaks from around the world. He has also worked at the Research Directory at Democracy 21, an NGO that works on the pressing problems of democracy in the 21st century. He holds a PhD in political science from the Charles University in Prague and has published extensively on the history of Eastern Europe during World War II and the Cold War periods.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is a great pleasure for me to be here in Juno. Exactly 10 years ago, I was in Providence, standing in front of the Rhode Island state capitol, and I told myself, well, it would be nice to visit the remaining 49. So this morning, Alaska State House became number 50 on my bucket list. So I became, thank you. So I became a proud member of all 50 States Club, and here's the proof. The Capitol collection with my photos at every single page. So yeah, I made it as probably the very first Czech citizen. I have been to all 50 states and to all 50 state capitals. I'm a historian doing research on the Czechs abroad and on the Czechs in the United States. So I always try to spend some time in the state archives and in the state libraries to do research, to consult the material. And it's really surprising and amazing that the Czechs ended up everywhere. You can find Czech traces really in all regions and all parts of the United States, including Alaska. So tomorrow I am going to the archives and let's see what I can find out. But today I will talk about a bit different topic. I'll talk about the rise of populism in the European Union and also in the Czech Republic, and also how the war in Ukraine has impacted the economy and societies in Europe, meaning the European Union. I will focus my talk specifically on the Czech Republic, or Czechia, the country I come from. Please don't mix it up with Chechnya, which is a bit different country elsewhere. Don't laugh, you know, some American journalists still haven't noticed this difference. Or they call my country Czechoslovakia, which doesn't exist for 30 years now, but Czechia is fine. Thanks to its strategic position, as you can see on a map, right in the very heart of Europe, it has always been a meeting point, a center of business and culture, and a place where the West met the East. Thus, we can also see it as a small laboratory, where the latest trends and the mood of the population copy what is happening in the European Union in general. If we use the language of computer game players, the Czech Republic is like a demo version of a real game being played beyond its borders. Before the COVID pandemic, my country had one of the lowest unemployment rates in Europe. Its economy was growing, the quality of life was very high, but still we Czechs were labeled troublemakers and an interior opposition within the European Union because of our lukewarm approach toward further integration of the European Union and cooperation with our partners on various issues. I would say general tension in the European Union, which has lasted for some years now, has also led to a rise of populism, one of a very serious threats to liberal democracy. I would talk about it a bit later because with the ongoing war in Ukraine, populism is a burning topic on a daily basis. So the Czech Republic is a small country in Central Europe with 10.5 million people, with its economy strongly tied to the larger German economy and with most of its foreign trade with other member countries of the European Union. It's been a stable member of the EU since May 2004, so almost for 20 years, and there is no real alternative for us than a deepening integration into the European Union. However, a phenomenon called Euroscepticism has dramatically increased in the past few years. What does this term actually mean? Euroscepticism entered the political discourse in the mid-1990s And initially it was almost exclusively used as an expression which focused on all kinds of opposition, criticism and negative attitudes towards the European Union and the progress of European integration. But in many cases, Euroscepticism was just subjective and vague in meaning, lacking any proper framework, and it attracted primarily less educated and less politically knowledgeable individuals. But this has changed in recent years. Public opinion about the European Union is now playing a major role, and it's, as I said, a burning topic. We usually distinguish between hard and soft Euroscepticism. Hard Euroscepticism refers to a complete rejection of EU membership, hand in hand with the rejection of NATO, whereas soft Eurosceptics support just the limited EU membership, but they are very critical of various aspects of the integration, such as the cross-border movement of people, adoption of a common currency euro. By the way, the Czech currency still continues to be the Czech koruna, or giving up powers and responsibilities, the local/state government, in favor of a supranational leadership in Brussels, meaning the European Commission, the European Parliament, and other European institutions. We can say that the current situation in the Czech Republic in many ways reflects the past. While they are not under directly or direct rule of another power, many Czechs feel dominated by larger EU nations. This is especially true of Germany, as the Czechs already have negative historical associations with Germanic people who dominate EU decision-making now. Let me remind you that the Czech lands were under direct German/Austrian rule for more than 300 years, and many Czechs see their national identity as having been defined from the outside. Criticisms of the European Union bring up this historical threat to our national sovereignty, the three historical periods in which the Czech lands were under the rule of foreign power, and the Czechs as a nation had to make concessions to survive. Speaking of the three historical periods, I mean the long period under the Habsburg dynasty, when we were part of the Austrian and later Austrian-Hungarian Empire, then the Nazi occupation during the World War II, and the Soviet supremacy between 1948 and 1989, while after August 1968 it was a direct military occupation. So this is reflected in many criticisms of the European Union that depict the Czech Republic as a pawn controlled by the West. And the EU encroachment on domestic issues is seen by many people as a clear evidence of a foreign rule. There is a feeling of a lost sovereignty as a result of EU membership, but you know, the thing is that by its very definition, membership means that any member state will have to give up certain aspects of self-governance in order to fully participate in the European project. And Eurosceptics are able to tap into these nationalistic sentiments in order to gain support for their cause, whether or not the loss of sovereignty is real or just imagined. There are many factors that may influence the growth of Euroscepticism, but one of the most important and the most significant ones is the expansion of the EU's authorities into domestic matters. Critics have said that there is they call it a democratic deficit in the governing of the European Union. They say that the decision-making processes in Brussels are too distant, strange and complicated, that the EU leaders are not responsible for their decisions to the Czech voters and public. The EU bureaucracy, inefficiency, disrespect towards the opinions, feelings and needs of the people in the member states, and also the fact that the European law overrides the Czech constitution and the Czech law in many cases have been criticized by all parties across the Czech political scene for the past 19 years of our membership. But recently there have been two issues that made Euroscepticism mainstream and a serious threat and a burning topic. First of all, it was the Brexit in 2016. We can say that it was a clear warning for the EU elites that the Union needed immediate reforms. I strongly believe that the Czech Republic should be in the middle of these changes for the better and the building of a new EU vision, because it's a win-win solution for everyone. We can show that we are creative, active, respectful of our partners, and not merely the ones who only criticize constantly, who don't care, who sit in the back, let the others to do the work and shout only when we don't like something. Some critics among the Czech politicians even called for a similar referendum, preferably leading to a Czechzit. But that's highly unlikely because, as I said, there is no real alternative than the European Union. And in fact, the Czech Republic benefits greatly from the European single market and other EU and the EU structural and investment funds. We have drawn billions of euros from these arrangements so that we could build highways and roads, we could protect our environment, renovate cities, modernize industry, allow our students to get university degrees from prestigious Western European universities, etc., etc. And yet, more and more people are calling for Czechzit. Why? I think that we have to look at this trend from a broader perspective, and we see that the rejection of the EU and common European values is closely tied to populism. What is it actually? Political parties lacking any ideological foundation and using populist appeals emerged in Central and Eastern Europe from the end of 1990s in general. These parties did not adopt any radical ideology, and until 2010, 2012, populism was not a prominent element of Czech politics, meaning mostly smaller parties and movements at the periphery of the political spectrum used some populist rhetoric. And compared to other countries in the region, the Czech Republic had one of the most stable and relatively closed party systems, and it was characterized by almost exclusive unidimensional competition, meaning there was one major party on the right, it was the Civic Democratic Party, and there was one major leftist party, the Social Democratic Party. But then, after 2010, 2012, the new generation of voters grew up, and these seem to be characterized by a lower level of identification with traditional left-wing, centrist, or right-wing parties. And they rather show the tendency to be attracted by simplified populist promises, and therefore to be linked with we call them protest parties or anti-establishment parties and movements. These political entities usually divide society into two antagonist groups, meaning the pure people, the good ones, versus the corrupt elites. They argue that the politics should be an expression of a general will of the people. They always emphasize a real or imaginary threat or crisis. They claim to speak for the good ones and attack the out-of-touch elites. You certainly remember that former President Trump often used the claim "draining the swamp in DC" during his campaign in 2016. So we had, similar rhetorics and similar narrative in the Czech Republic. Furthermore, it is often problematic, and I'm not speaking about the Czech politics, but about the European politics in general. It is often very problematic to identify the parties and movements on the left-right political spectrum, because they combine elements from both ends of the spectrum, and they are using also this populist language. There is also a very important role of a charismatic leader, and rhetorical features such as tabloid style, dramatization, and the use of the social media to spread the fake news. So if we take a look at populism from the European perspective, we see that the populist parties and movements have established themselves as a powerful political force and even became integral members of coalition governments in many countries. In Italy, Denmark, Sweden. You definitely heard about the Alternative for Germany, whose power and importance is exponentially growing as a reaction of the former, the reaction to the politics of the former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who led the country between 2005 and 2021. So yeah, we can say this is a broader general trend in Europe. In the Czech Republic, we also have our Trump, billionaire Andrej Babiš, who is the fifth wealthiest man in the country. He is also a man surrounded by multiple corruption scandals. He's actually a very interesting case. The red cap inspiration is obvious. It says strong Czechia. Babiš was born in Slovakia. In 1990s, he founded a conglomerate called Agrofert that operates in the fields such as agriculture, logistics, energy, chemical industry, forestry. Today, some 230 companies are covered by the umbrella trademark Agrofert, worth of more than $4 billion US dollars. It's kind of a nice family company, right? Babiš decided to enter the politics in 2011, claiming that the traditional political parties did not do a good job in ruling the country. So he established a new party, or better to say, anti-establishment movement called ANO. ANO means yes in Czech, but it's also the abbreviation for the actions of dissatisfied citizens. He mainly criticized the corruption affairs that were, in his opinion, much more frequent and worse than in the neighboring countries. And when he stepped into the political arena, many political scientists used the term Berlusconization of the politics, named after the Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. He passed away recently, right? Who also established his own party. He owned the biggest media in Italy and basically dominated public space. And Babiš actually followed his steps. He bought two largest daily periodicals, he bought a radio station, he bought a TV channel, and he's been using them effectively to influence the public opinion. His marketing team prepared a very smart face-to-face campaign in the streets. Sometimes it looked like that Babiš was everywhere. He handed out donuts at subway stations in Prague. He was visiting regions with a mobile booth with fried chicken. He was meeting people and presented promises of higher wages, higher pensions, and basically benefits for various groups of population. We must admit he devoted an incredible amount of time, money, and energy to the campaign before the parliamentary election in 2017, and it was worth to him. ANO movement won the election in October of 2017, and he became our prime minister for 4 years. ANO was defeated in the following parliamentary election in October 2021. So Babiš was ousted from power, but he still keeps very strong supporter base. ANO movement is the strongest opposition party in the parliament, and Babiš himself ran for the president in January of this year. He made it to the second round, where he was fortunately beaten by Peter Pavel, retired general of the Czech army, known abroad mostly for his long career in NATO, where he also chaired its military committee. And during the very long presidential campaign, it was also the war in Ukraine that belonged to the most frequently discussed topics, and that brings us back to populism. Because it was Babiš and his team who brought new unflattering dimension of populist rhetoric into Czech politics and public space, and he obviously wanted to use the war and the tragedy of the refugees for his own purposes, because he sensed correctly it stirred up emotions in the population. The Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, 4 countries in Central Europe, maintain closer relations than they do with the rest of Europe through a local alliance called Visegrad 4, or just V4. And in recent years, each one of the members has had to deal with increasing populism, more or less connected with negativism, focused either on corruption, heritage of communism, and dissatisfaction with developments after its fall, and the transition to democracy. And again, the EU factor plays a role. It's the national interests versus the directives coming from Brussels. Let me emphasize that people from the countries from the former Soviet bloc are actually very sensitive about any pressure from outside. I've already talked about the feeling of German dominance that many Czechs share, but there is another similar comparison. As you know, for more than 4 decades, following the end of the World War II, the communist regimes of Central Europe, including the one in Czechoslovakia, received strategic decisions from Moscow alone. Official propaganda talked about the Soviets as liberators, protectors, greatest friends, equal partners, but in fact, the countries behind the Iron Curtain were nothing more than satellites and subordinated vassals of the Soviet Union. We used to call these regimes people's democracies, but in fact, they were far from any participation or involvement of their citizens in decision making. In late 1980s, the rulers were completely distant from their citizens, and the whole communist regime was just a rotten castle falling apart day by day. And so the current relations, and I would say the abyss of misunderstanding between Brussels, meaning the European leaders, and the individual member countries and their citizens sometimes remind some of the old times before the fall of the Iron Curtain. The analysts and sociologists warn that there is a widespread mood in the society that the old values and guarantees are gone, that the government is more of an obstacle to achieving prosperity than a facilitator, that mainstream media are not telling the truth, and therefore that it's necessary to look for alternative sources of information. Simply put, that there is some dark conspiracy, some deep state behind all of us. And populist parties and movements and politicians are naturally trying to take advantage of it in order to gain political support. This narrative of omnipresent conspiracy and threat was to be seen also during the so-called European refugee crisis. That's the term given to a period beginning in the spring of 2015, when rising numbers of people arrived in the European Union, traveling across the Mediterranean Sea or overland through Southeast Europe. And speaking of the Czech Republic again, vast majority of the people would have preferred to remain completely untouched by the influx of non-European foreigners. And some politicians, including Babiš, who was the member of the government since 2014, he was a Minister of Finance, and as I said, he became Prime Minister later in 2017. These politicians immediately understood that the fears and the concerns of the population could bring them political profit easily. And they began to emphasize issues such as the spread of infectious diseases, terrorism, and formation of ghettos and isolated Muslim communities as a clear consequence of accepting refugees. And they also claimed that they were the only ones who could protect the people, protect our way of life, national interests, European civilization, despite some nefarious interests of dark forces in Brussels. Another shining moment of populism was the coronavirus crisis, of course. Various conspirational theories about COVID-19 and its origins, theories about the real impact of the vaccine on people's health, changing of the DNA, etc., found enough listeners among frustrated citizens who blamed the government for the economic difficulties and impoverishment they were facing because of the quarantine and restrictions. The situation in the Czech Republic between 220 and 222 was pretty much the same as in the United States. We were under the lockdown for a couple of months. We had to wear the masks in public for almost 2 years, and of course no one was happy about that, meaning additional points for the populists. So we barely had time to recover from the pandemic, and we had to face the consequences of the war in Ukraine. It is the fact that the Czech Republic is one of the European countries that has taken most of the Ukrainian refugees. According to the latest data, my country, which again has the population of 10.5 million, has granted temporary protection to 500,000 of people from Ukraine, which is kind of equivalent to 5% of the entire population since last February when the conflict began, February of 2022. Also, In the spring, the Czech Republic signed into law a package of 3 government bills, collectively referred to in the media as Lex Ukraine, providing the war refugees with health insurance, access to the labor market with no restrictions, humanitarian allowance, social services, childcare, etc., etc. In exchange, I would say that Czech companies kind of expect that they will be, allowed to participate significantly in the restoration of Ukraine when the war is over. You know that from the beginning of the conflict, 20 months ago, all 27 member states of the European Union have shown incredible unity and strength and have provided Ukraine with significant political, financial and military support and also humanitarian aid to refugees. In addition, the European Union adopted a whole scale of sanctions against Russia and Belarus. The EU agreed on altogether 11 sanction packages in the past 20 months. The latest one was adopted in late June, and it should disable or complicate Russian export through third countries. And as I've heard, they are working on another package, number 12 in a row, right now. The sanctions included the prohibitions of transactions with the Russian banks, prohibition of Russian broadcasting and propaganda channels in the European Union, prohibition of most of the imports from Russia, also sanctions against individuals linked with the Kremlin and freezing or confiscation of their property. And also more restrictive rules for Russian citizens when applying for visas. Now it's more expensive, it takes longer time, and it's in many cases it's almost impossible to get European visas. So the Czech Republic belongs to the hardliners in the European Union and says very clearly that Russia is the aggressor and must pay for that. It needs some courage to act like that, because the Czech economy always relied heavily on energy imports, and virtually all the gas originated in Russia before the war. This left the country scrambling for alternative suppliers, and remarkably, by the end of last year, we had reduced the Russian gas dependency from 97% to just 4%. And that happened within a year, within a few months. We were able to replace it with liquefied natural gas from Norway, Qatar, or even the United States, which is distributed to Czechia through a special terminal in the Netherlands. So that went well, but still, half of Czechia's oil comes from Russia, and we still need to find a new supplier of raw materials for 2 nuclear power plants. So our energy dependence on supplies from Russia was and still is obvious, and it needs to be seen as a security threat as well, because the Kremlin doesn't hesitate to use gas and oil as political weapon and instrument of pressure. In the past 2 years, the price of gas and other commodities doubled or even tripled in some cases, and of course that was another tempting chance for the populists to show themselves, to organize public protests, to criticize the steps of the government. As mentioned earlier, among the countries of the EU, the Czech Republic has become one of the most outspoken supporters of Ukraine. And the newly formed populist and anti-establishment movement, involving a very strange mixture of socialists, communists, as well as far-right radicals, began to spread the narrative, stressing worsening macroeconomic conditions, especially high inflation. Last year, our inflation rate reached 20%, so it was really a lot. The populists said that we are going to suffer, we are going to freeze during the winter, we are going to lose money and living standards only due to our support of Ukraine. They presented a very, I would say, simplified solution. The war is a minor regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We should not intervene. The weapon supplies mean only more prolongation or an extension of the conflict. And they say that the very best solution would be to force Ukraine to give up part of its territory, thus to satisfy Russia, which will withdraw its troops. The war will be over and everyone will be happy again. They say that they are the only ones calling for peace, but in fact, if you examine their communication with the public and content of their appeals and messages, it's full of anti-liberal, anti-EU, anti-American, anti-West and xenophobic narratives, depicting Vladimir Putin and his regime as guardians of the traditional values and Christianity, defending them from Western decline and decadence. Not a single word about war crimes, about bombed cities, about mass graves, kidnapping of children, etc., etc. So there is an obvious bias and prejudice. For now, fortunately, these, I would say, false populist saviors attract only a fragment of the population, between 5 and 10% maybe. According to the polls, the vast majority of the citizens of the Czech Republic still support the continuation of financial, material and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But the longer it goes on, the lower the support. And logically, the people are getting more upset and they criticize the steps and the measures of the government, which had very bold plans how to restart our economy after the pandemic, and suddenly, tens of billions are going to Ukraine and to the support of Ukrainian refugees. So it is very complicated, but also fascinating times we are living in, and I'm sure that we'll be reading about them in history books very soon. At the end, let me also share my personal experience from Ukraine, because from time to time I take part in the election observation missions organized by the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Even before that, I had a chance to visit the Zakarpattia region of Ukraine, which is the westernmost part of the country, as a tourist, because my own grandfather was born there in 1934, when it was part of Czechoslovakia. Then they were expelled by the Hungarians, who annexed the territory in 1938. But the election observation missions brought me also twice to Ukraine. Actually, only a few months after the Maidan revolution. It was 10 years ago, or 9 years ago, for the presidential election in May of 2014, and then for the early parliamentary elections in October. I had a chance to spend some time in the capital, in Kiev, then in Kharkiv, in the second largest city in the east, only some 20 miles from the Russian border. I was also observing the election in small rural areas near Ivano-Frankivsk in the west of the country. And it was a very interesting experience. Don't misunderstand me, I'm not biased. I have very deep sympathies for Ukrainians. I have many friends among them. I even studied Ukrainian language for 2 years at the university. However, when I was there, I came to understand that the country was in a very deep troubles, even without any Russian interference. Meaning the level of corruption, the kind of Soviet mindset, backwardness. Just 10 miles from Kiev, you saw a different world. Underdeveloped 19th century-like villages without proper infrastructure, poverty, and basically no light at the end of the tunnel for most of the people who didn't have enough money and didn't have the right connections and, enough money to bribe the authorities. And the elections were a great example. On paper, everything looked perfect. A new election law based on EU recommendations, all procedures were followed, members of election committees seemed to be very well prepared and competent. Even the voters were very excited and the turnout was very high, between 65 and 70%. But during the E-Day, we realized there was something fishy. We saw obvious intimidation of voters, some unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles, campaigning in front of the polling stations. Sometimes the secrecy of voting wasn't ensured. There was this strange role of police officers and military personnel. And above all, there were strange men in black leather jackets with 3 cell phones who looked like the ones in charge, the real bosses on site. They were receiving orders from some other bigger bosses over the phone. They were giving orders and instructions even to the chairman of the election committees. So it was very strange. And these guys were present at all the polling stations during the E-Day, and even later in the evening at the district election committee for counting and tabulation of the results. To be fair, I met the very same times also in other countries. I had a chance to observe the elections in Belarus, in Mongolia, in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in Georgia, meaning the country of Georgia, although your state of Georgia might need some election observation as well, right? So I met the very same times also in the other countries in the post-Soviet space, and you can always recognize them. As I said, black leather jackets, too many rings, 3 cell phones, and usually white socks and half shoes. Let me emphasize, that was not the fault of ordinary Ukrainians. That was simply the fault of the system they were living in. The system that looked nice, democratic, transparent, meeting Western standards at first sight. However, in reality, it was kind of rotten inside, fake in many ways, developed and deformed by the oligarchs and crooked politicians whose only concern was to keep power and to embezzle as much money as possible, not to help the people, not to contribute to a healthy progress of the country as a whole. So I felt really sorry about that, and my Ukrainian friends actually shared the same frustration. That was the situation back in 2014. Since then, Ukraine undoubtedly made an incredible jump towards becoming a modern country with a strong civil society, democratic institutions and control mechanisms. But many issues still remained unresolved. There were still too many, how do you call it, elephants in the room, right? Meaning the Soviet legacy and strong ties with Russia and corruption. And Ukraine was only halfway to being considered a real candidate for EU membership and Western structures before the war. So therefore, I believe that the ongoing war, although it's an unspeakable tragedy and catastrophe, might also become a unique opportunity for Ukraine and the Ukrainians to start over, to break free of the shackles of the past, to gain a new confidence and new national identity. You know, for example, in my country, in the Czech Republic, for the past 30 years, the Ukrainians were mostly seen as a cheap labor force. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians were coming every year to my country as seasonal workers in agriculture, as workers in factories and construction workers. Thanks to Ukrainian men, we have our highways, our subway system, houses, shopping centers. Thanks to Ukrainian women, our corridors and offices are clean, our shirts are ironed, our gardens are well maintained. So it is my sincere hope that after this terrible war, we will acknowledge and admire the Ukrainians as heroes, fighters, defenders of freedom and democratic values. Because I think we really need such an inspiration these days when populism is on rise. So going back to populism and to the current political situation, as I said, the longer the war goes on, the lower the support among the people. But for now, and hopefully for the upcoming months, we can say that the Czech citizens and also the citizens of the European Union in general strongly stand behind Ukraine. Although the warmest wishes of all of us should be for a quick end to this insane war and not seeing suffering of the Ukrainian people any month longer. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, if you have any questions, please go ahead and come up and form a line. I'll get us going by very gauchely asking you about a completely different country. Slovakia recently had an election, I believe. Do you have general impressions of how that went and what its implications are for the immediate neighbors in Europe as a whole?
Don't quote me, but Slovak politics is a mess. And there's a real chance that the former Prime Minister Robert Fico, and we can also call him or label him as a populist leader, might come back to power, which is not a good news for the European Union. But again, if you look at it from the perspective of the whole Central European region, it's nothing unusual. You know what Viktor Orbán is doing in Hungary since 2010. We can see the same, we can find some similarities and some similar patterns in Poland, ruled by the Law and Justice Party. which is trying to, basically destroy independent judiciary, independent media. For now, we can say that the Czech Republic is kind of an island in the wild sea, because our government now is pro-European. The same, our president Pavel, but we'll see what happens next. As I said, Andrej Babiš still has a lot of influence and a lot of power, and it might easily happen that he'll follow up on Fico in Slovakia and will become our prime minister next year again. So yeah, it's very complicated.
Thank you. It was a very comprehensive presentation.
Thank you.
On the Czech Republic. Sometime in mid-September, and I was in Czech Republic then, there was a major protest in Prague against of supporting Ukraine and a war in Ukraine. And I also observed among the Czech people where I was, in the Central Euorpoean in Prague, apprehension of many Czech people supporting the war, financing, Ukraine for the war efforts. So, and not only in Czech Republic, but also in Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and many other European countries. Many of them are questioning soon the whole Europe will be Ukraine because 12 million people left the country, after war erupted. So they ask a question, how that massive population of 500,000 refugees in Czech Republic, of young people, what I noticed, they are not handicapped, disabled, old babushkas and dedushkas, they're young people, men and women. How this is going to help Ukraine to win the war, and how this is going to end? Because Ukraine already lost 400,000 soldiers, not counting the wounded people.
Yeah. Not an easy question to answer, but I met many Ukrainians, and I can say they are very friendly and hardworking people. They are not the economic migrants. They are staying in the Czech Republic, but they want to come back. They are working hard. Their students are among the best students at our universities, and they really have the intention to come back to their homeland and to help to restore it or to reconstruct the country destroyed by the war. You're right that we accepted 500,000 of Ukrainian refugees, but the situation is even worse in the neighboring countries. We don't have borders with Ukraine, but Slovakia does, Moldova, Romania, Hungary, Poland. So even more Ukrainians ended up there for a certain period of time. So it's very difficult to predict because we are still in the middle of these events. What I can say is that the Ukrainians in the Czech Republic, at least, they adapted easily. They didn't get assimilated, but they adapted. For example, my daughter, she's a 6th grader, and they have 5 Ukrainian kids in their class. These kids learn Czech very easily, and they are, they became part of the collective. So that's a good thing. But again, we have to think about it that one day they'll and their parents will want to come back home. As I say, we were in very deep economic troubles, and we had a depression caused by the pandemic. And thanks to Ukrainians and thanks to Ukrainian workers, we were able to survive the worst. I mentioned the inflation rate of 20% of last year. Now we have between 3 and 5. So the situation got much better. Thanks to the Ukrainians who are working hard and who are accepting, the lower paid jobs, which the Czechs don't want to. So I think that their presence now was a great benefit for us.
Thank you.
So you're taking in lots and lots of Ukrainians. How about the Russians? We understand a lot of Russians are leaving their country as well, and they're going to neighboring countries. Is the Czechia seeing are receiving a lot of Russians?
Yeah, we granted some student visas for Russian students, and some well-known members of the, we call it Russian opposition, were allowed to come to the Czech Republic. Otherwise, we are not giving visas to Russian citizens and to the citizens of Belarus neither. So the whole European Union is kind of a closed space for the Russians. There are no flights. The cars with Russian license plates, they are not allowed to enter the European Union. So there are not so many Russians like the newcomers in the European Union now. Of course, we had like significant Russian population even before the war, between 20 and maybe 25%, living mostly in Prague and in Karlovy Vary, in the western part of the country. There were, Czech Russian communities, but they were not linked to the Kremlin. Most of them, they were just, half Czechs, half Russians. They got Czech citizenship, and they settled.
So do you know where they're going? The Russians?
Well, as far as I know, they are trying to settle in Turkey and in Serbia and in Thailand and in other non-European countries, in Egypt. Of course, it depends on the money. If they are rich, then they can afford, to spend the whole year in a resort in Thailand. But for the ordinary people, for the middle-class people, it's definitely difficult because the European Union, in general, refuses Russian citizens.
Thank you.
Unless they prove or unless they give some proofs that they are anti-Putin and that they have political problems back home. These people are granted asylum, like political asylum.
I am of Czech background on both sides of my family. My grandparents on both sides came to Cleveland, Ohio, and I ended up in Juneau. And so I am concerned about the Czech Republic, particularly seeing it surrounded by Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, where populism seems to be becoming more and more popular. How optimistic are you that the Czechs will be able to resist populism? And I assume that is probably closely related to the economic situation in the Czech Republic. And what other factors do you think will help keep Czech from going the way of Poland and Hungary?
I have to say that fortunately the Czechs are very smart and they don't rely on just one side. For example, I can call myself a liberal mid-class voter from the capital, and in the past 10 years I voted for 5 different parties. So we have options. The citizens have options. If you call yourself socialist or conservative or centrist, then you have options. So that's good that one party wasn't in charge wasn't in power for too many years. So the power is shifting in the Czech Republic and in the Czech Parliament. That's one good thing. The Czechs are also kind of a specific nation in the Central European Union because we don't believe in God so much. Although we are surrounded by the Poles, by the Slovaks, by the Austrians, by the Bavarians, all very religious people. That's not the case in the Czech Republic. If you want to understand the nature and the character of the Czechs, please read the novel Good Soldier Švejk by Jaroslav Hašek that nicely depicts, the Czech character. On the first sight, we are very obedient, we are very reliable, but when the authorities turn back, we are start to make fun of them, and that worked with the Austrians, with the Germans, with the Russians, now with the what you can call the European leadership, some officials in Brussels, some bureaucrats in Brussels. So we are making fun of them, and we are finding our own way how to proceed. So that's specific for the Czechs, and I think this nature could also help us to go through the threat of populism, or this storm of populism we are facing these days.
My grandmother, who was born in Praha, was raised Catholic, and she came to the United States in her late 20s, did not speak English, and I don't speak Czech. But I heard through my mother that as soon as she got to the United States, she gave up her religion because the nuns in Praha were really mean to her.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
And congratulations on all 50.
That was Dr. Martin Nekola in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with KTOO. It was recorded October 5th, 2023 at KTOO in Juneau, with support from AELMP, Core Alaska Kensington Mine, Sea Alaska, and the University of Alaska Southeast.